have a special talk by Jeanine Rhemtulla. I'm pronouncing in Arabic, this is what I was told. So, nice. Jeanine from the University of McGill, professor at the Department of Geography. She is, in terms of research, focused on land use, as you can see, ecosystem function, and human well-being in forested landscapes. It's a nice summary of her webpage if you go forward her webpage. She has 3 current projects, one in Quebec, one in South America, and one in India, dealing with related topics. We are very fortunate and thankful for you to come and to give this talk.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Marwan. And thanks to everybody for coming out today. It's been really fun. I've been here for a day and a half so far, and I've just met fabulous people and had really interesting conversations, and I look forward to more. So thanks for taking the time. And the 3 projects, there's actually a 4th in Wisconsin, and that's the one I'm going to start with. So we'll start in the temperate region. So the title of my talk, Land Use, Ecosystem Function, and Human Well-Being in Forested Landscapes. So land use is a critical driver of change in ecosystems. And land use, as most of you probably know, is any way in which we use the land. So one of the most common things that we tend to do is to clear forests for agriculture. But we can also have land use change in terms of using ecosystems for rangeland. We can do it in terms of a lighter impact kind of uses as well. So for example, using forest land or other land as a national park also counts as land use. So you can see some various pictures here. I'll just point this out because I'll come back to this later. These are peasant farmers in the Peruvian Amazon making charcoal, and I'll talk a little bit more later about that process. So in some rangeland down here in India and rice paddies, and this is actually southern Quebec. You can see the imprint of land use on the landscape. So we usually think of land use as being a local process, right? You clear a forest here, it will have a local impact. But in fact, land use is becoming so pervasive and extensive in terms of both the spatial extent and also the temporal duration of those legacies that we're now starting to think about it as having global effects. So 40% of the Earth's land surface has now been fundamentally transformed by land use of various kinds. The land use legacies, even if we use land use and then we abandon that land use and let the ecosystem kind of recover, those land use legacies can persist for hundreds to thousands of years. So there's just some really fascinating work which has been done in Europe, showing that in forest land in Belgium, areas that have been forest for the last 2,000 years, they can still detect the imprint of Roman agriculture 2,000 years ago in terms of soil nutrient cycling and also plant species composition. So those legacies persist for a really long time. And they also start to have a really huge impact in terms of ecosystem functioning and the global environment. So when we think about climate change, we're usually thinking about fossil fuel emissions, but in fact about 25% of CO2 emissions between 1850 and 2000 come from deforestation. So it has a huge impact in terms of environmental issues. So land use has in fact been called the single greatest factor contributing to global environmental change. All right, so that's my pitch to make you understand why I think it's important that we be looking at land use as a process. It's a critical process in terms of environmental issues. Now obviously we don't engage in land use for no reason at all. So typically when we're engaging in land use, what we're trying to do is to get some kind of something out of an ecosystem. And so I'm going to focus a lot today on forest ecosystems and on agriculture. And very often when we're clearing forests, we're doing it for food, right? To plant crops and to gain food. So we can think about it as in terms of trade-offs with ecosystem services. So an ecosystem service is any kind of service or benefit that ecosystems provide to us. And this is John Foley and a number of other people as well have come up with a nice little kind of these flower diagrams, ways of looking at different kinds of ecosystem services that are provided by ecosystems. So here we have a natural ecosystem. You can produces very little in terms of crop production, but maybe has a lot more of these yellow bars here, forest production, some habitat and biodiversity, lots of water flow regulation, water quality, and so forth. We clear that into intensive cropland, and of course we immediately have a huge return in terms of crop production, but the other kinds of ecosystem services which are really important in terms of sustaining other things are going to be much less. And so the holy grail of sustainability, of course, is that we're going to do, in this case, maybe some kind of cropland with restored ecosystem services. We're going to have a little flower where the petals are all kind of more or less the same length. And so this is kind of where we're trying to get. And we do an awful lot of hand-waving about this. You know, hand-waving first of all about whether it's actually even possible to do this. And then hand-waving also about what the trade-offs actually look like. You know, we're starting to have more empirical data, but we really don't have a lot in terms of how do we manage these trade-offs. When we do one thing, what happens to the other ones? And is there actually a way that we can balance this? Is there actually win-wins, or do we have a lot more lose-loses when we're trying to do this? And so a lot of my research is actually focusing kind of at a local scale of trying to figure out how we're able to do this, and then to project up to the regional scale so we can try to see over larger landscapes what this might look like. So kind of a conceptual diagram of what I'm going to show today, and that kind of largely how I think in my mind. You'll see I've got various kinds of projects, but in my mind how they all come together. So we start very often with some kind of land use. I do a lot of historical work, so this is meant to think about back in time, going back into time over hundreds or 200s of years, trying to understand what land use we're engaging in ecosystems, how that affects ecosystem structure and function today. So I do a lot of field work down here to understand this, and again also historical work to reconstruct these changes. As ecosystem structure and function changes, that has a change in terms of the ecosystem services that are output. And of course that winds back to the people, right? So people are making decisions about what kind of land use we're going to do, but this can come around and have an effect on people. And so I'm going to present a couple of case studies today. I'm going to start by discussing work that I've been doing in Wisconsin, and that's focused much more kind of on the science of the ecosystem and much more at a regional level, doing a lot more historical work. And the work that I'm moving into more now is really trying to tie together the human side of the picture so that we can complete the circle. And I'm going to be talking about work that I'm doing in the Peruvian Amazon in a swidden fallow cultivation system, so slash and burn essentially, where people are really embedded in ecosystems and the decisions that they're making are having an immediate effect, coming back immediately to affect them in terms of their human well-being. So human well-being, poverty, inequality, food security a little bit I'll talk about. All right, so part one, legacies of historical land use in Wisconsin. So here's Wisconsin. For those of you, before I did my PhD work in Wisconsin, and I actually didn't really know where it was until I ended up there. Even though I grew up in Alberta. So Wisconsin is over here. It's nestled up against the Great Lakes, and it's kind of at the other end of the prairies. And it's a really interesting state because it's really at an ecotone. So you can see here the southern part of Wisconsin. I guess I should start with the northern if I follow my slides. The northern part of Wisconsin is the hardwood coniferous forests, and so it's kind of the bottom end of these great big deciduous and then boreal forests to the north. The southern part of Wisconsin is right at this ecotone, the end of the prairies and going up into open oak savannas. So it's two very different kinds of ecosystems that we're dealing with in the north and the south. And Aldo Leopold, for those of you who've read Aldo Leopold, the Sand County Almanac, and Aldo Leopold did a lot of his work right through here. So it's also the home of ecological restoration. And I think you'll see why when I start to describe the environmental history of the state. So if we go back to the early to mid 1800s, the landscapes of Wisconsin were still more or less intact. There were Aboriginal peoples there, and they used the land in various kinds of ways, but not nearly having as many impacts as the European colonizers who came. So we go back to mid 1800s. In the north we still had lots of big trees. In the south, again, open oak savannas and prairies. By the late 1800s, the settlers had started to move away from New England and into this part of the world, starting a lot with clearing of timber. So we see really very quickly in the process of about 2 or 3 decades in the late 1800s, all of the northern forests were almost completely cleared. Parts of the north and also in the south, you can see this is north obviously with all the tree trunks that are here. They converted that land into agricultural land. In the south, almost all of those prairies were easily dug up and put into agriculture. The 30s hit, so it was a really difficult time. A lot of the areas, particularly in the north, were not very well suited to agriculture, and people were poor and having economic trouble, so a lot of that land was abandoned. And if you fast forward to today and you drive through northern Wisconsin, those areas are all mostly forested now. And it's a big recreational area. Everybody's got, cabins up there, and it's a glacial landscape. It's dotted with lakes. It's really beautiful. And if you don't know anything about this history, it's really easy to believe that those forests have just always been there. So it's a really interesting place to be studying because a lot of people just look at it and imagine that it's always been like that. So of course the question though becomes, it hasn't always been like that. It's got this long land use history. So the question I started out with was, you know, at the regional scale, can we actually still detect the imprint of land use legacies? So a lot of people have done work at the local scale to say at the local scale we can detect it, but what about at the regional scale in terms of the major tree species? Can we detect a legacy of land use? So I'm not going to talk a lot today at all about data sources or methods, although I'm happy to take questions about them. But I do an awful lot of historical work, so I'm not trained as a historian, but I spend a lot of times in the archives as a detective, just trying to dig up whatever kinds of historical sources that we can use to reconstruct past ecosystem states. And of course, most of those data sources were never intended to be used in that way. And so we do have some kind of complicated statistical methods that we can use to put in to kind of account for the uncertainties and the biases that are in the records, to try to make sure that what we're seeing isn't just an artifact of the kinds of records that we're using, but actually is more closely connected to what the landscapes actually looked like. So there's a series of documents that I've used in Wisconsin. So dating back to the mid-1800s, in the era prior to settlement, we used the public land survey records. So if any or most of you have probably flown across the United States before, and if you look out the plane window and you see that checkerboard pattern that's all the way imprinted across the United States and parts of Canada as well, that dates back to the public land survey. So the public land surveyors came out and they basically divided the land into 1 mile by 1 mile section for homesteaders, so that a homesteader could go into their local land office and ask for a quarter section of land that they could go and farm. And when they were doing that, when they would drag chains out 1 mile by 1 mile, and when they would come to the corners, they would use an axe and they would slash a couple of what we call witness trees. So they'd slash the witness trees and they would write down, this is whatever, township 6, range 7, so that when a farmer would go out and look for his land, he could go and look for the witness trees to know where the corner boundaries of his property were. But what they did was that the land surveyors wrote down all of these trees. So they would say, at this particular section, we found a maple tree that was this big, we found an oak tree that was this big, we found a pine. And so we took all of those million witness trees for Wisconsin and put them into a giant GIS database. And then again, you can start doing some clustering techniques with statistics to figure out what those forests looked like at the time that the surveyors went through and before people had actually cleared them. So that's kind of our baseline data on what the state looked like. In the 1930s, there was a Make Work project with the CCC that went through and mapped all of Wisconsin again to take a look at what was going on with land use, because so much land was being abandoned. And then for current work, we've got 2 different sets of land cover. One is just a satellite image. It's just a Landsat. We call it Wiskland. Comes from 1993. And then forest inventory data from the Forest Service that we use. So these are kind of become the comparison points to take a look at how the forests have changed through time. All right, so the first result, what we find is that, perhaps not surprisingly, there's been a fundamental shift in forest composition. So here we can take a look at, this is Wisconsin in the mid-1800s. The dark green color is coniferous forests. The lighter green color through here is deciduous forests. And then this brown color down here is savanna. So that's baseline what the state looked like prior to widespread land use. The 1930s, so this is the peak agricultural period. Peak agriculture just before the abandonment or just at the abandonment period. And you can see in the north that the coniferous forests are completely cleared and been replaced with deciduous forests, and then the yellow color down through here is agriculture. So we've moved from savanna mostly in the south to agriculture, and there's still significant amounts of agriculture here as well. So if we look today, you can see that it still looks surprisingly similar to what it did in the 1930s. All right, so again, still mostly deciduous forest, a lot of agricultural land, a little bit more dense forests through here than we had through there, but certainly still really quite different from what it was there. All right, so this is kind of like the overall picture of land cover. We can dig in now and take a look at the actual individual forest species and see what's going on with those. So I'm going to show you a series of maps here. This is white pine. So there was an awful lot of white pine in northern Wisconsin, and that was a really economically very valuable species and one of the first that was cut. And so here basically you're looking at Wisconsin, and the important thing here is that the darker the color, the darker the orange-red color, means the more white pine there was. So that was the distribution of white pine prior to settlement. That's what it looked like in the 1930s. Very little left. And that's what it looks like today. And there's just a tiny bit that's coming. These are very sandy soils through here and up there, so it's starting to come back a little bit, but really nowhere close to what we used to have. Can do the same thing for hemlock. So hemlock is another coniferous species, less economically valuable, but important from an ecosystem perspective. And again, you can see in the north, tons of hemlock. A reasonable amount left by the 1930s because it didn't have that same economic viability. And today it's mostly gone completely from the landscape. All right, so what's it been replaced by? Well, here's aspen. So aspen is what we call a pioneer species, an early successional species. It's got these really light seeds that can come in and germinate really well, especially after fire. So some of it in the mid-1800s. By the 1930s, this is what we find all over the place. Okay, and predominantly, because again, all those lands were cleared, I didn't mention, but there was a lot of fire that followed all of that clearance, because you got a lot of basically dry wood material on the ground. It sets fire very well. And aspen likes that a lot in terms of succession. And if you look at it today, there is still an awful lot more aspen as an early successional species than what we had before. You can look at oak because it's a southern species, so you can see that there was an awful lot of oak in the south originally. There's actually still a fair amount of it in the 1930s. And this is predominantly because it was fairly open oak savanna, right? So you'll have an oak tree, but then you'll have an awful lot of grasslands underneath it. So they weren't clearing a lot. They could still, I mean, they were cleared in some places, but you can still do agriculture without losing all of those trees. And if we look today, we start to see a decline in oak. And I'm not going to show the map, but if anybody's interested, what's replacing it in the south tends to be a lot of maple, especially red maple. All right, so that's a handful of species. What about the size of the trees is the other thing that's changed a lot. There's been a fundamental shift in stand structure. So here going down, we see this is the 1850s, 1930s, and 2000s. And then going across, we have the size of trees. So here are your small trees, 12.5 to 25 centimeters. This is the DBH, the diameter of the tree. Medium-sized trees, 25 to 50, and these are the large trees, greater than 50 centimeters. So again, you can see in the 1850s that you've got a fair number of medium trees, good number of small trees, and a good number of big trees. Of course, by the 1930s, almost the whole entire landscape is in these really small trees, and today that still tends to be, from a distributional perspective, where most of the landscape is. So there's been a real shift in the size of trees as well. All right, so I could go on and show you tons and tons of these maps. We can do lots of other different species. We can look at other kinds of stand structure. But the bigger question is, how does this all fit together? So if we want to put it together in kind of a synthesis of what this means for species composition and size across the state, I'm going to show you, so this has a scary name. It's a non-metric multidimensional scaling ordination. But I'll walk you through it for those of you who might not have seen these before. Oh, I should back up a second. So here you'll see in all of these maps, there's these light gray lines, which hopefully you can see from the back. So these are individual ecozones. And so what I'm doing is that each of these ecozones will end up being one point in my ordination. So you can take each of these points. This point, for example, will be one of those sampling points. And what I've done is taken all of the information that we've got about all of the species, all of the size structure, all of that, and I've dumped it all into the statistical analysis to reflect kind of a synthesis of what the state of that one particular sample was. Okay, and then the points that are colored in are in the north. The points that are open are in the south. And the most important thing to understand about this analysis is that points that are closer together are more similar. Points that are further apart are more different. Okay, so you got a cluster of, this is what northern Wisconsin looked like. Actually, I should put a date up. That's the mid-1800s. So northern Wisconsin, southern Wisconsin. By the 1930s, you can see that you've got a huge change in what the state looked like. And then we can look in the 2000s. And so what you can see is that there's the movement from the mid-1800s. It becomes extremely very different in the 1930s. The 2000s, we're starting to move back to where it was originally, but we're still fairly far away. And then the other thing that you can see is there's been kind of a contraction in environmental space. So there's been kind of a homogenization across the state in terms of the difference north-south. The south is now becoming a little bit more similar to the north than it was previously because those points are taking up less space in the ordination. You can look at the factors that drive it. So when you take a look at all the different factors that we dumped in, large trees and hemlock as the species tend to be the defining characteristics, what's pulling these points apart. Whereas down here it's much more the small trees. If we go on the x-axis, we've got oak species that are down here and aspen and hardwoods that tend to drive points being more in this direction. So you can see because we're losing the oak, that's partly what's leading to the contraction of space down here. We can look at trajectories through time. So how does an individual sampling kind of unit ecozone change through time? And I'll do that by taking individual spots. In the 1800s, I'm going to draw a line, an arrow between this and whichever point it becomes the 1930s, and then back to the 2000s. So you can see, and then again, the north is on this side. So you can see here we've got a story where our sampling units start here. They move very far down in ordination space, and then they start to come up again. And they start to come up predominantly along the same trajectory, right? So we're not really seeing huge differences in terms of the overall species composition and stand structure. Although what's going to prevent them from going fully back up there is that we need to get more large trees and hemlock on the landscape. In the south, though, is a very different story. You can see here that the points are starting here, moving here, and now kind of boomeranging off in a completely different direction. And that's happening in large part because we're losing oak. And turns out what originally sustained the oak in southern Wisconsin tended to be a lot of aboriginal burning. And so we've taken fire off of that landscape, and without introducing fire back in, it's fire that maintained kind of that open understory and allowed the oak trees to persist. And that's a story obviously the same in parts of British Columbia as well. And so without putting fire back in, kind of that low intensity frequent fire, what we're starting to see is maple and other species coming back in. Okay, so that's the change in ecosystem function and structure that's going on. So the question then becomes, well, what does this mean for ecosystem services? And I'm going to show you just one example, which is forest carbon. And as I mentioned before, carbon is an interesting one to look at because of the link between deforestation and forest clearing is such a large contributor to CO2 emissions. The other thing, obviously, is that when we clear the forests, the CO2 goes up and becomes a part of the climate change problem. But as these trees are regrowing, those trees are also sequestering carbon. So this process in Wisconsin, in parts of New England, in parts of southern, eastern Canada, has been a huge subsidy as well in terms of when we look at emissions. If we didn't have these forests that were growing back over such large areas, a lot of that CO2, more of that CO2 would be ending up in the atmosphere. So this is a subsidy, and one of the questions that we've been having is, well, how much longer are we going to retain this subsidy? At what point do these trees come back to holding the same amount of carbon that they did historically, so that we're going to start to see less of that carbon being absorbed in this particular process? All right, so that's what carbon looked like in the mid-1800s. And again, the darker the color, the more carbon. That's what it looked like in the 1930s and what it looks like today. So, and I'll show you some numbers in a minute, but essentially we see two things happening. One is that we still have an overall decline. So we still only have 60% as a whole of the carbon on the whole landscape than what we did historically. There's also been a shift in terms of where that carbon is. So you can see in the south, we have a lot more carbon through here because we've lost the kind of open oak savannas, and we've got a lot denser forests that are coming back. So from a carbon perspective, that's a good thing. From an ecosystem perspective, we've lost that open oak savanna habitat and all of the critters that go along with that. And in the north, you can see especially this big hole right through here where we really haven't come back anywhere close to what the historical carbon baselines were like. So we can ask a question about, well, what's the future sequestration potential? How much more carbon can we sequester on this landscape? And I'm going to look at it in two ways. One of it is on forest land. So areas where we have existing forests, how much more carbon could those forests sequester? Some, but not a whole lot more. On agricultural lands now, we can take a look. These are areas that were cleared of forest and that are currently in agriculture, but were once upon a time forest. And that's where you see the much larger potential is. So if we actually wanted to go back to historical levels of carbon in the state of Wisconsin, these are the areas that would need to be reforested, and these are the areas right now that are under agriculture. So you can see that there's a huge trade-off. And it's interesting because in Wisconsin, as in other places, the agricultural Ministry of Agriculture and the Ministry of Forests are two very different ministries. So you've got the forest ministry that is saying we need to do whatever we can do to come back and get to historical forest baselines. And in fact, the work that we were doing was supported in part by the Ministry of Forests, who are really interested in finding out, well, how much more sequestration potential is there? And then you look at it and you think, well, yeah, there's more sequestration potential, but it's obviously in a completely different kind of land base that's being managed by a completely different other agency. And those agencies don't talk together, obviously. So we can take a look at it in terms of numbers. So this is just the teragrams of carbon, so 400. This is what we've got today. In areas that originally had forests, this is just the amount of extra carbon that we have in southern Wisconsin ecosystems that wasn't originally there. And if we look at wanting to be able to get back to that historical baseline, so there's this purple much left in terms of existing forests, and this represents the amount of carbon that we could sequester, but with an agricultural trade-off. So I'm not doing a ton of work left anymore in Wisconsin, but I've started to shift some of the questions that I was asking there into a new project that I'm starting in southern Quebec, so which we're loosely terming land use, connectivity, and ecosystem services in Quebec, and trying to push on two things. One is to take a look at more kind of a field-based level. So Wisconsin was really large and regional. Here we're trying to look a little bit more at the local scale to understand what some of the interactions are, and in particular to understand the importance of spatial connectivity. So not just, you know, kind of where the forests are today, but what the spatial configuration of forests in the past and agricultural lands looked like in the past, and how that influences current ecosystem structure and function, and then also ecosystem services. So branching out to consider a whole bigger suite of ecosystem services than what I'd done in Wisconsin. So this is work that's being done by Martine LaRouche, who's a master's student with me. So she reconstructed the land use history of this particular region called the Montérégie in southern Quebec. And what's really fascinating about the area, oops, you can just look at it here. So this is the study area. This is basically the forest land is in green. In yellow is what's called other. The historical topographical maps that we use doesn't really define it, but it seems mostly to be cleared land for agriculture. So you can see from the 1860s to the 1910s to the 1990s that there's actually been fairly little change. So we don't have the same story of kind of clearing and then abandonment and recovery, which is actually somewhat surprising for maybe for those of you that might be familiar with forest transition theory, that talks a lot about how in developed countries what you see is you see this clearing, widespread clearing, and then abandonment, and the forests come back. And this is an area where that hasn't happened at all, which is actually really interesting. So in fact we see continued deforestation and fragmentation with relatively little forest recovery in this region of southern Quebec. And so then Martine also went into some of these different kinds of forest fragments, and some of them were originally under agriculture and have come back as forest. Some of them have been forest used in various ways through time, but been forest throughout the whole period. And she took a look to see if she could see the imprint not only of historical land use on that particular place, but also how much forest was in the surrounding landscape in terms of affecting current ecosystem or current forest patch species composition. And what she found was that species composition in the forest fragments was much more correlated with historical connectivity than it was with what was going on historically on a particular patch. So if you're in a particular forest patch, what was going on 100 years ago around you is the most important thing that influences the kind of species diversity that you have today. Whether or not currently you're surrounded by forest or currently you're isolated, it's whether you were isolated or connected in the past that actually has a much bigger influence. And so that's really, really interesting to think about if we want to understand kind of what's going on today in terms of biodiversity, that we really have to have a solid understanding of what was going on 100 years ago. And likewise, if we want to influence what's going on in our landscapes 100 years from now, we need to be thinking not only about land use here, but also about how we are arranging land use through time and making sure that things are much more connected. And then the second project we have going on, this is Delphine Renard, who's a postdoctoral fellow who's been working with me. And she, in the same region in the Montérégie, is quantifying interactions among ecosystem services through time and space. So if you think back to those flower diagrams that I represented with the multiple ecosystem services, what she's trying to do is to go back all the way to 1900 and to quantify, using historical records, ecosystem services of different types. And then she wants to look through the whole entire landscape and say, well, through time, as those flower diagrams change, what kinds of bundles of ecosystem services tend to stay together as we lose one or the other? Are there some that are always associated with one another? Are there others, for example, if you clear forest, you're going to lose forest biodiversity, but you're going to increase crop production? That one's fairly straightforward, but asking some questions about some of the other ones. So here's just a picture that shows a few of the ones that she's looking at. So nature appreciation, summer cottage values, maple syrup, try to do some soil stuff with phosphorus, crop production, pork production, and things like that. So really trying to branch out to look at a whole suite of ecosystem services and how those change through time. All right, part two. So here I'm going to branch out a little bit and talk about the work that I've started to do in the tropics, where we're really trying much more to bring in the human side of the story. So poverty and conservation in the Peruvian Amazon. And this is a collaborative project that I'm doing with Oliver Coombs, who's a development geographer at McGill, Yoshito Takasaki, who is an economist in Japan, Sylvia Wood, who's a PhD student, and Carlos Rengifo, who's our technician who works down in the Amazon. And obviously lots of villagers in the Amazon as well who put up with our zillion questions and household surveys. So San Jose, Peru. San Jose is a pseudonym, but it's basically a small community that's on the Amazon River. And if you take a boat up the Amazon River, as you float along, you'll see along the shores, dotted kind of here and there, are these really small communities that look something like that. People are poor through here in the village, especially in San Jose. People are incredibly poor. There are kids here, some kids that are actually taking the charcoal off of one of those big piles of wood after they create the charcoal, and they're lugging it back down to the dock so that they can take it to the city and sell it. So people are poor in this community in an absolute sense. One of Oliver Coombs has been working in this community for the last 20 years, and one of his original insights as a development geographer was that despite the fact that people here are poor, you would go in and you would just look at people and think, well, they're all poor. There is actually a fair amount of variability in terms of poverty. So some people are very, very poor, and other people are just poor. And so one of the things that we wanted to do with this project was to dissect that poverty and to see whether we could see the differential kind of poverty was there, if that made a difference in terms of the land use decisions that people were making, and what the ecological outcomes of that would be. So could we, in essence, find kind of an ecological imprint of poverty on the landscape? So people in the village, in this area in general, practice swidden cultivation, swidden fallow cultivation, so slash and burn agriculture. So here's a guy, very poor, right? People don't tend to have chainsaws or any kind of mechanized equipment. People do everything by hand. So this is a picture that I took way up at the top end of one of the watersheds where we work. Giant tree. This guy is basically cutting the tree down with a little hand axe. And when I went and I saw him, I said to him, well, how long have you been at this? And so he told me, well, he'd been cutting down this tree just like this for 4 days. And he thought it was going to take another 2 days before this tree actually fell. So it's a slow process, especially when you're clearing from primary forest. So they clear the forest, they burn it. They plant various kinds of crops, so yucca is the really big crop, sometimes followed by pineapple, and then followed in some cases by orchard species as well for tree fruit. And then they abandon the agriculture at a certain point, and it goes back, obviously doesn't go back into this kind of primary forest, it'll go back into some kind of secondary forest. So swidden fallow agriculture is a major driver of tropical deforestation, which is why we care about it from a conservation perspective. But the fallows, as they come back, are also important opportunities. Okay, so they're important for the recovery of soils, of soil structure, of soil nutrients, important for the recovery of carbon, both carbon in the soils and carbon sequestration, obviously, in the trees that are growing. They're important from a habitat and biodiversity perspective. They're also obviously critical for livelihoods, right? People are clearing the forest so that they can feed themselves. So there's a real kind of contention here of, well, is there a way that we can actually, from a conservation perspective, find a way to do a win-win with livelihoods and food security? Again, so I come back to this again. So just to repeat, we're going to start with land use, take a look at how that affects ecosystem structure and function, and then feeds back to human well-being. And here in particular, I'm going to talk about poverty and about inequality. So here's San Jose. This is basically a high-resolution satellite image that shows you a little bit of what it's like. So the Amazon actually goes off like this, and this is a tributary that comes down through here. This is the center of the village. If you can see the little square, that's the soccer field that's at the center of all these little villages. There's another tributary back here, and then basically this is the land base that people have. And it's close to Iquitos. It's about, whatever, a 3 or 4 hour drive by boat upriver from Iquitos. So it's a peasant village. It was a former agricultural estate, so it was founded in the late 1800s as an agricultural estate to feed the rubber boom. About 800 hectares in size, 72 households, about a total of 400 people in the community. And it's spatially confined, which is one of the interesting things about it. So the village is here, there's another village through here, another village here, and another village back through here. So basically the enclosure, the last village up through here came in the 1980s. And since that point, the villagers that live here have this land base to work from, and that's basically it. They can't push out any further because there is no land. The land belongs to other people. So their only option is either to find land and to use the land that's available within the community, or else to leave the community and go someplace else. This is a long-term study site. So Oliver's been working here for 20 years. Mostly doing the human side of stuff, and so now we're trying to combine the two to take a look at the interactions. So methods. We did household surveys in 1994, 2007, and 2011. I created, when I first started working with Oliver, a comprehensive GIS database with all of the land holdings. So when I went down to do household surveys, I asked everybody, I said, take me out to your fields, I want to map them. So we went out to their fields, we mapped the outer boundaries of all of their fields, and then using oral history, I calculated, or collected, rather, recorded the annual land use history, going back as far as people could remember it, for each of the individual fields. So going back in some cases as far as 1965, we'll know, well, you had this field, you cleared it in 1965, it was in crop in yucca for 3 years, then pineapple for 2, then you abandoned it, we had successional forest that was there for maybe 5 years, then you cleared it again, and so on and so forth. So for every single field that's in there, we have this annual land use history going back through time. And then we've combined that with demographic data that we collected, so we know when all the people in the household were born, when they left the community, we know the household size, we can reconstruct that, and we know something also about their income and other assets, which for the most part are very low. So that's what it looks like. You can see each of these different colors represents the land holdings of a different community. This area through here is all lowland, so it gets flooded every year, so not a lot of people actually hold land through here, which is why it's very doesn't have a whole lot of information. And then there's a bunch of other holes in here which Sylvie, the PhD student, is starting to fill in. But in general, this is basically, we've got information for all of these different households on the annual land history and then also on the demographic and income data that we can go back to. To try to validate some of the oral history, I went back and did air photo interpretation. So I took a series of historical air photos, interpreted those, and then compared them with the oral history data, which turned out to be surprisingly good, which was great. And then we've also taken, Sylvie's taken vegetation and soil data in a number of different fallows and orchards as well to try to understand some of the ecological consequences. So this is just to give you a flavor of what that land cover looks like. So 1965, the dark green color is primary forest. The lighter green color is secondary forest. So this is the lowland area, like I said, where people really don't cultivate very much because it floods every year. And so this was kind of the last remnant patch of primary forest. And you can see this is 1972, 1978. You can see it's just being eaten away. 1991, it's now what we call degraded primary. In 2007, it's really mostly gone. But apart from that, this area through here is just kind of this dynamic movement between, in orange, the cleared land, and then in this light green color, kind of the fallow or secondary forest, which regenerates. All right, so we started out by asking a question of whether there were poverty traps in this community. So I mentioned, as you'll remember, that there's variability in the kind of absolute poverty that's there. Some people are very, very poor, other people are less poor. So we wanted to know, a poverty trap is essentially can occur when households get caught into self-reinforcing economic equilibria that perpetuate the low standards of living. So you can think about it, if you're very poor and you start engaging in certain behaviors, or you've got only very few assets which don't allow you to escape from that kind of condition into a situation where you might have more assets or more land. And so that's what we wanted to know was, is the variability that's going on in this community, is this just random variability? Does it change through time? Or do we actually see kind of distinct clusters, distinct equilibria of poverty in the community which are being perpetuated through time? So it turns out that the answer is yes. The answer is yes, but it wasn't the same answer that we thought we were going to find. So it turns out we thought that the variability was going to come in terms of the amount of land that people owned today. But it turns out that the really important factor is the initial land holdings that people start out with. So originally, when the first founding people came to the community, they were given large blocks of land. I can go back to this. You can see through here, there's some really big, large squares, right? So these were the original land grants. The original handful of families that settled here in the 1960s were each given one of these big parcels of land. Everybody else that came afterwards either had to count on people that owned these big things giving them little pieces of it, so gifting land, or else they had to go through and pick up just small pieces of land here and there that nobody else was using. Okay, so it turns out that the initial amount of land that you start out with as a household has a huge influence on the land use decisions that you're going to make to come from. So the household size isn't very different. This is, I should say, the land rich and the land poor. So land is the main asset in this community. People don't have a whole lot else other than land, so that's kind of how they make their livings. So household size is mostly the same. The amount of assets that they have that are not related to land are more or less the same. Even the current land holdings. So through time, a household's land portfolio will evolve. They start out with whatever they start out with, but they might gain some more, or they clear more land, or whatever they do. And so it turns out that at the end of the day, the two groups actually have fairly similar amounts of land. But what's really important is the amount that they start out with. And so there's small differences in the types of land that they own. The land rich tend to own more in the upland and less in the poor own less in the upland. But there's two really big differences that emerge that come from these initial land holdings. And so they end up being what we're calling land use traps. So the amount of land that you start out with influences the way that you decide to manage that land. And even as you add more land to your portfolio, you get stuck in the way that you're managing that land because of the legacies. The decisions that you make have a long lag time because you're planting crops or planting trees that last for a long time. So one of the really big things is the mean fallow length. So land-rich people have a much longer, they leave their land in fallow for much longer than the land poor are able to. And they're also planting different things. So the land rich are able to plant a lot more orchard species, and I'll show you a picture of this in a minute, than the land poor are able to. And that's because an orchard, if you're going to put a tree orchard in, takes an awful lot of time for those trees to mature. So your land is basically caught up and stuck in that orchard for a long period of time. And you can't obviously make that decision unless at the time that you're making that decision to plant that, you have enough other land resources that you can do crops. So there's the short fallow crop that we talked. So the land poor end up having a much shorter cycle than the land rich. The land rich have a cycle that's about 22 years. The land poor have a cycle that's about 10 years. And obviously, if you have a cycle that's 10 years, you're going to be cycling much more quickly, right? So in the same space of time here, maybe you've cycled through 5 times. You've cultivated it 5 times. You got the land rich. Well, they're keeping it much longer in fallow. And so then they've got a shorter number of fallow cycles. And then what we're calling the subsistence crop trap. So as I mentioned, everybody's planting yucca. Most people will follow that up with a crop of pineapple. What they do after that depends on whether they're land rich or land poor. If they're land rich, they're going to follow that up with an orchard crop, and they put fruit orchards in, and then they can sell that fruit. And then those trees are also really good for creating charcoal later because the trees end up being much bigger. When they cut down that forest, they can do a round of charcoal. If you're land rich, then you're not going to tie up your land in orchards at all, and so you've got less of that product which is marketable. You're just going to let the land go. You're going to stop managing it. You're going to let whatever secondary forest regeneration comes in. It's just going to succeed. And then eventually, the land rich and the land poor are going to slash and burn that forest and go back to a yucca crop. All right, so that's kind of the land use. And so the question that follows from that, and the question I hope you're all asking yourselves now is, well, what are the ecosystem impacts of that, right? If we've got the land rich that are doing one thing in terms of fallows and in terms of orchards, and the land poor doing something else, well, does that have an ecological, an ecosystem impact? So it turns out the answer is yes. For the short fallow trap, if you're stuck with short fallows, you're going to end up with poorer soils. So here we've got mean fallow length here, and this is just available phosphorus on this side. So the longer your fallow is, the higher the amount of phosphorus you're going to end up with. And this is, I should point out, this is just a p-value of 0.09, so it's a trend and not a really super significant result. But it's there nonetheless, and we can compare this to primary forest just to give you an idea of how all of the secondary fallows compare. So primary forest is up at around 45 kilograms per hectare. So all of these, none of these are coming back to whatever the original primary forest phosphorus looks like. We can also look at the number of fallow cycles. So again, if you've got a shorter fallow, you're going to have a whole lot more previous cycles. So we took a look for each of those fields, the ones that had many fewer or many more previous cycles versus fewer. And again, the same thing. So the more cycles you have, the less phosphorus that's available. So if you're stuck in a short fallow trap, you're going to be stuck with poorer soils. Interestingly, it doesn't turn into having an effect on biodiversity. So here again we have average fallow length. So again, the longer the fallow, and here we're just looking at a species richness measure. So if you go back in that fallow that comes back and you measure tree biodiversity, well, it actually really doesn't matter all that much if the previous cycles were long or short. What matters more is the total length of use. So it doesn't matter, what matters most is the year in which a farmer cleared it. So if a farmer cleared that land in 1960 versus clearing it in 1980, regardless of how long those fallows were, or regardless of how many cycles they were, it's the date of that original clearing that turns out to be the most important thing. So from a conservation perspective, it doesn't matter if it's a rich farmer or a poor farmer, it's the length of time that something is being cultivated that has a conservation or biodiversity implication. So here we're just looking at the years since initial clearing, and that's just the species richness. So the longer the site has been used, no matter how it's been used, the lower biodiversity it will have. And again, the primary forest, just so you can see the difference here, we're talking about species richness from 60 to 80 species, or 60 to 100, and primary forest 232. So there's the initial clearing from a conservation perspective is the most important decision that somebody's make. If you clear it and you continue to use it, that's going to have the hugest effect. It doesn't really matter what kind of management you're doing. It's the decision to clear that matters the most. And then the other thing, I think given the time I won't go into the details of this graph, but the distance to primary forest is also really important. So the closer that you are to primary forest, the more species you're going to have. The further away you are, the fewer species you're going to have. So there's also kind of a configuration issue across the landscape that turns out to be really important. We look now at the subsistence trap, so the fact that some farmers are planting orchards versus other farmers are not. So if you're stuck in a subsistence trap and you're not able to plant an orchard, again, you're going to end up with slightly poor soils. So we're looking at phosphorus again. If you're taking a look at orchards, so the fallows that have had orchards in them have more phosphorus in them than the fallows do. So again, if you're a richer farmer with more initial land holdings, you're going to end up with soils that are better. In terms of biodiversity, which is the other thing, so a fallow forest, obviously here I'm just comparing, if you're going to compare biodiversity in a fallow versus an orchard at contemporary time right now, a fallow's obviously got a lot more species in it because it's just got naturally seeding in, and from the seed bank you've got species coming in. The orchard, obviously, people are maintaining it so that it's primarily got the fruit tree in it, so it's going to have very few species other than what that orchard is. So if you're looking from a biodiversity perspective, people that have fallows have got a lot more biodiversity than people that have orchards. But if you wait for the next cycle and take a look at the fallows that will come back after they cycle and cultivate it the next time, it turns out that into the future, in the future cycles, the biodiversity that comes back in the fallows is no different. So if you have an orchard history, it doesn't matter in terms of the biodiversity that comes back. So whether your field was previously fallow or previously orchard, you've basically got the same number of species. Then I should say down here we've got fallow age, so obviously the older the fallow is, the more species that it's got in it. But whether it was previously fallow or previously orchard, doesn't matter. All right, so we can scale up now and take a look at the effect at the landscape level. So here I'm kind of focusing on these individual fallows and orchards to see what's going on. We know through time that there has been a change in the distribution of land holdings in the community, right? So we have land rich and we have land poor, but the amount of land that different people own at any one time, or control at any one time, or using at any one time changes. So we've got here a map that looks through time from 1970 to 2010. And this is a Gini index. So the Gini index is just a measure of how equitably or how equally land is distributed amongst households. So the bigger the number, basically more unequal. And if it's down at 0, if the Gini index is 0, it means that every household has exactly the same amount of land. And so you can track through time that with the original land grants when the community was first established, the Gini index was 0.3. It starts to go up, so land distribution becomes more unequal because you got these people that come in that have these big land parcels, other people are moving in, pick up small pieces of land. We have a second series of land grants that occurs that basically equalizes things a little bit more. And then through time again the inequality creeps up, and then we start to see intergenerational transfers. So the parents that own these big blocks of land start gifting parts of it to their children as they become of age to start their own households. So through time we can see that there's a real change in terms of the way that land is distributed. Okay, and so if we're interested kind of from a human well-being perspective, maybe we're interested in trying to make the landscape more equal so that we don't have some people that own a lot of land and other people that own very little, but we would like from a poverty alleviation perspective to try to equalize things. So the question becomes, can we take a look at, you know, this variability in inequality and have a look at how it relates to a conservation outcome? And so it turns out if we take a look at land clearing, the amount of land or deforestation, land clearing that's going on in the community, we actually have we have a trade-off here. So the more unequal that we have land distribution, we've basically got lower amounts of land clearing. And as inequality, wait a second, how does that work? The more unequal the more equal, wait a second, higher inequality, lower land clearing. Oh yeah, there we go. So higher inequality, that makes sense, lower land clearing. So if you've got a land distribution which is more unequal, we've got some people that own a whole lot of land, these really big blocks of land, and then other people that earn much, that control much less, we actually see a whole lot less land clearing. So from a conservation perspective, we might want to be up here because we want to limit the amount of deforestation that's going on. From a poverty alleviation perspective, we might want to be over here so that we've got people that have more equal access to land, but that looks like from this analysis might actually end up leading to more land clearing. So if we tie that all together and look at the interactions between poverty, land use, and ecosystem functioning, so it looks like the initial land holdings, a family that's first coming into the community, the initial amount of land that they own, that they're able to take, to use, has a real legacy through time from a personal perspective that can launch them into various kinds of land use poverty traps. If they don't start out with enough land, they can get caught up in these land use poverty traps. The poverty traps, both of the ones that I presented, will lead to poorer soils. We haven't yet made the link back to saying, well, they've got poorer soils. Does this actually affect crop productivity in the following cycle? So that's work we'd like to do. We haven't done that yet to link that back. And we can see that biodiversity actually declines with the length of use and the distance to primary forest. So the biodiversity is going down no matter what people are doing. So in this particular system, all the land use management that people are doing is all kind of unsustainable from a conservation perspective. And inequality appears to have a better conservation outcome at a landscape level. So understanding the links between these things is critical to developing policies, or to trying to develop policies that combine conservation with poverty alleviation, to really understand what the links are between these things and whether there actually are policies that we can put in that are going to be able to bridge those two goals, or whether it is actually going to be very difficult because those two goals are going to require very different policy interventions. So the next steps that we're trying to do in the Peruvian Amazon with this project is to take a look at more ecosystem services. So we're trying to come up with some flower diagrams of our own, looking at a number of different kinds of ecosystem services. And so here, this is just a preliminary one that Sylvia, the PhD student, was putting together for orchards versus fallows. Very preliminary data, but this is what we're trying to do, is to branch out and look at a number of other ecosystem services. And then we're also trying to complete the loop, to look more broadly at the feedbacks to human well-being. So if your soil nutrient status is going out, can we actually make a link with that back to crop productivity, so that we can show that people that are caught in these poverty traps are actually having, this direct feedback through the soils in terms of livelihoods. And then finally, just one quick slide for a project that we're about to start in India, in the home gardens of Kerala. And Kerala is in southern India. So Kerala in southern India has got these great home gardens that have been, they've been around for thousands of years, and people talk about them as being kind of one of the great sustainable resources in southern India. You can see here, this is a tea estate, and this is a house, and then surrounding the house, people will have these little home gardens that are basically just a mix. They're very biodiverse. You can have up to 200 different species in here, and people will plant things like, mangoes and coconuts. They've got pepper and cardamom and other spices, a whole mix of different kinds of crop products that they use. And what we're starting to see is that there's rapid land use change in southern India, where people are just clearing these things. They're small, but they're clearing them, and they're starting to transform them into rubber plantations or coconut groves or other things that are cash crops that have an immediate return financially. And so we're starting to see this process happening, but nobody has a really good grip on exactly how many home gardens there are in southern India to begin with, how quickly they're changing, what they're changing into. And then obviously you can think about southern India, if you've got all of these, you've got these cultivated areas, so here's a tea estate, but you've also got rice paddies, a lot of other agricultural land, and dotted throughout it, you've got these little oases, these little home gardens that may well serve as biodiversity kind of oases. So the question becomes, well, when we start to clear these, how quickly are they being cleared? What are the biodiversity implications? And then also, what are the food security implications? Or are there food security implications? To what degree do people depend on these home gardens? And if they cut them down, do they just go to the supermarket and buy what they need? Or are there actually different changes that are occurring that are more important than that? So, and I'm just pointing out, there's two graduate students who will be starting, Thomas Fox and Teresa Coyle, who will be starting this summer. We've got an undergraduate, Corey Lask, as well, who will be coming on board. So I'm really excited about this project. I have nothing more to show about it than this, but I'm really excited about it. I'm always happy to talk about it. So I'm going to finish just with one last slide, trying to pull back again to the landscape level. So I'm calling it sharing, sparing, and repairing. And the question ultimately, I mean, we can go in and look at the relationship between land use and ecosystem functioning and human well-being. We can do that in a particular place and to try to understand empirically what the relationships between those things are. We also need to scale back and start asking questions about what does that mean for how we manage our landscapes and how we structure the spatial configuration of those landscapes to balance ecological function and human well-being. So we have a kind of a gradient of land use intensity. This always comes back. So we've got kind of our intact or natural or whatever other contentious word you want to use for it, but these original ecosystems, you know, ecosystems that are used a little bit more lightly, some of the agroforestry ecosystems, and then we've got intensive agriculture. You know, there's really a question of, well, how do we balance our landscapes? So the sharing and sparing, some of you might be familiar with that particular debate that started to come up over whether, in terms of producing food, should we be shifting all of our food production or more of our food production into systems like this, because they've got a lot more biodiversity in them, they're a lot more wildlife friendly than a system like this? Or are we better off to kind of push off to the margins, to split up our landscape so that we've got more kind of intensive, but that allows us to retain a whole bunch of these intact ecosystems, you know, and that this stuff is nice, but perhaps not the best way to balance those two things out. So it's a really interesting question, kind of at a mosaic level of a landscape. How do we actually manage these landscapes? The debate around sharing and sparing, it really takes a look a lot at biodiversity and at food productivity, crop productivity, but very few people are looking at other ecosystem services. Nobody is looking at human well-being. You know, what does it mean for people? Do people prefer to live in this or prefer to live in one of those? So that's kind of the direction that I'm going with the work that I'm doing, and I think there's a ton of interesting research that still needs to be done, loads of opportunities, and so that's what I'm looking forward to. So just end with some thank yous to mostly the villages of San Jose who put up with our very intrusive questions, other collaborators, graduate students, and then funding. And I'm happy to take questions. Yeah, Kai.
Thank you, Jeanine. That was really an interesting summary of a whole bunch of different interesting projects. I have a whole bunch of questions.
Excellent. You're allowed one.
Yeah, I'll see if I can come back to ask another one in my turn. To start with, you talked about poverty traps, and you showed some effects of, you know, initial land poverty. But where exactly do you?
Where do I? The trap?
Yeah, where is it that the actions that people are taking are actually reinforcing their state of initial poverty? I didn't.
Okay. Yeah, so I can go back again. Well, there's that huge, terrible long table that I presented. So essentially what happens is people start with less land or more land, and they have to make decisions about how they're going to manage that land. And so what we find is if you start out...
Yeah. The alternative hypothesis would just be that they're coping, right? And that it's effective coping strategies.
Right.
And that they're making up for the difference, the initial difference. And that would, I would characterize that as not being a poverty trap, but actually the opposite. And I'm wondering whether you can distinguish between those two.
Okay, so they're coping because they've got less land, and so therefore they're
adopting different strategies that are appropriate for that, and that,
okay.
You know, they are actually escaping the initial conditions.
Okay, except that they're not escaping the additional conditions. And I think that's where the idea of trap comes in when you're doing an economic analysis. So when you're doing the actual analysis, what you're looking for is different equilibria in terms of the way that people are managing the land. And so what's interesting here, people are starting out with very different amounts of land. Through time, they're actually evolving so that their land holdings are actually fairly similar. Yeah, but the thing that's interesting about it is that when you first start, you're making a decision about how you're going to use the land, right? You're making a decision about how so if you put in an orchard crop, you're kind of stuck with that orchard crop, right? You put in the orchard crop and you decide, well, this is what it is. I'm going to put this in. Well, I got to wait 6 or 7 years before it's producing food that I can sell, right? And then beyond that, you're going to let it grow and you're going to cut it in terms of charcoal. If you start out with very little bit of land, you can't actually put land into orchard because you don't have land that you can tie up for that period of time. And so it's that there's kind of a lag in the system. I don't know, maybe if we follow it out for another 30 or 40 years, we'll find that as people accumulate more land, they're actually going to be able to jump into planting more orchards. But in the period of time that we've got, we don't actually see that happening. Not satisfied? Yeah, okay, yeah. Yeah, yeah.
I'm curious as to why your non-land assets, which if you look at that table,
yeah.
arguably one of the clearest, metrics of livelihood
Yeah.
quality that
Yeah.
They're similar. And I know
Yeah.
you said you've done a lot of household surveys. So,
Yeah.
do you see differences in other livelihood metrics that
Fishing.
support this poverty?
Fishing.
trap?
Yeah, so what happens is the people that don't have a lot of land are going to end up going to do fishing, and fishing is one of the things that they can sell. So you'll see that the people that tend to do more fishing in the village are the people that are land poor, and so that's the one way. So this number gets made up, okay, it's not a very high number. People are not, it's mostly subsistence agriculture, so people are not selling a whole lot. They're selling the orchard fruit if they have it. Even the pineapple they don't sell very much. They're selling orchard fruit. Some people do handicrafts, which doesn't make up for very much. They're doing charcoal. So charcoal is one way that they can actually sell a lot, and then they're fishing. And so the land poor end up coming, I think, to this number. I don't remember what the breakdowns is in terms of how much of the non-land assets, actually the economics, the non-land assets, well, the non-land, actually, this is wrong, because the non-land assets basically come down to whether people own boats or motors or things like that. So that's more or less the same. What I don't have up here is the actual economic income that people have, which I should put up here because it's more or less the same thing for both groups too. So, so they're balancing out in different ways. They're doing a little bit more fishing. They're doing a little bit more charcoal. The lowland areas that I showed you, the primary forest there is being cut by people that are cutting that for charcoal because they don't have access to other land.
So then I guess I have the same question, Skylar. How
Yeah.
is that a trap?
I guess what we're looking at here is what we're talking about it is a land use trap in terms of they get trapped in terms of using particular kinds of management styles. So what we don't see happening, for example, the mean fallow length between these two groups ends up being very different through time. So it ends up being these two different land use management strategies that people are getting into, and despite the fact that they pick up more land, they're still maintaining a shorter fallow length, and they're still maintaining kind of fewer orchards on the landscape, if that makes sense. Yeah.
So just to follow up.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah.
Again, it seems to me that what you might be seeing is actually less a function of the ecosystem and land use management from that perspective, more a function perhaps of more of a social effect.
Right.
And so what you're seeing is, because one would expect convergence.
Right.
Right, as you get more land, you should be able to put more land
Right.
under orchard.
Right.
Have the ability to do it, but they're not doing it.
Right.
What you're seeing actually
Yeah.
is path dependency
Right.
in practice.
Right.
My father did 10 years of fallow,
Yeah.
under 10 years of fallow,
Yeah.
type of stuff.
Yeah.
Possibly.
Yeah.
Again, not a trap, right? Again.
So meaning not a trap because they could get out of it if they wanted to.
Well, it's a trap. It's not a poverty trap, right? It's.
So, and I will say we've been calling them land use traps, and maybe this is where I shouldn't be using the words poverty traps, but using it more of a land use trap in terms of the way that people are using the land.
But it's, again, the equilibria, the placement of the cause of the equilibria.
Yeah.
I'm not entirely convinced
Okay.
of, right?
Yeah.
In terms of where the decision comes from to replace those orchards.
Yeah.
It's not because you didn't have land a long time ago, because you have land to do it now.
Right, although there's a lag in the system, right? Like the decision to put in an orchard, I guess the decision to put in an orchard today, here we're looking at this over the whole trajectory of time, right? So
the interesting trajectory
yeah.
of time of fallow length
Yeah.
of the land
Yeah. Yeah.
over time
Yeah.
would indicate
Yeah.
whether you're getting convergence or not.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. But the economic analysis shows that it doesn't, that we do have these two very distinct equilibria. We don't have, like, the length of time, we've only got 40 years, so we've only got 3 and in some case 4 cycles.
No, okay.
No, but it would be interesting to talk more about that, right? Whether it's a question of just the language that I'm using, which is incorrect, or whether it's more, because we really do see this. We really do see, and then the other thing that's really interesting, when you talk to people, if you talk to a person who had more land holdings and you ask them how long the land needs to be in fallow before it's got the fertility to come back again, they will also tell you that it takes a much longer period of time, right? So that's kind of the social thing as well. It's like they have this idea in their mind of this is how long one needs to have something in fallow before I can plant it again. And there isn't one single number that everybody converges around. It's like if you're in a system where you're leaving it much longer, then you also have the belief that you need to leave it much longer.
Which would argue first reflecting on the option side.
Yeah, okay.
Juanita.
I also have a question about this particular case. I found it super interesting. Thank you for presenting the information. I have a question, I guess, about the idea of, or maybe the framing around the ecosystem imprint of poverty.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if y'all have looked at or compared these particular instances with perhaps the ecosystem imprint of wealth, let's say.
Right.
Because, you know, the other major driver of tropical deforestation is both cattle ranching and soy production.
Right.
And from studies that I've read in northern Guatemala, when you really see the incapacity of
Yeah.
land to reproduce forests, it's, for example, with cattle.
Yeah.
And that could be regarded as
Yeah.
production.
Yeah.
So I'm just curious if in that area you see those different kinds of land uses, or if this is the
Right.
primary
So yeah, this.
driver in that area.
Yeah, so in this particular area we're working, this is the primary driver. So it's basically swidden fallow cultivation and it's subsistence agriculture. But certainly in other places of Latin America, then yeah, it's definitely cattle that are going in the soy production. And you're right, I like the idea of the imprint of wealth in terms of that, because that tends to be, I think, when we look overall at tropical deforestation from land use, I think that tends to be the bigger driver, although we don't have really good numbers in terms of swidden fallow cultivation. It can be really hard to know what those numbers are, yeah.
You have a question? Any other
When it's my
question?
turn again.
Are you going to alternate?
I'll ask a question.
Sure.
It doesn't have to do with any traps.
Excellent.
First of all, this study is very interesting in the context of your other work, which has had a longer time scale.
Right.
You've already brought up that you're dealing with data that you used a very difficult method, it sounds like, to work out land use since the early 60s. What happened before the 60s? How does that inform your perspective of all this? And then a related question, perhaps, is that you've dealt with various scales in these different studies here. You've
Yeah.
looked at a village scale,
Yeah.
quite a local scale. In southern Quebec, it's a relatively small scale.
Yeah.
But then the whole state of Wisconsin.
Yeah.
What do you make of your broader analysis in scale terms? I mean, are you somewhat more suspicious of local studies having done work at the state scale, where you might be worried you're seeing particular changes in a particular context that are driven by
Right.
variables that can't really be captured at the local scale?
Right.
How do you reflect on that
Yeah.
in your overall research?
Yeah, okay, so I'll take the second question first. And I think, I mean, for me, one of the reasons that I do both local work and regional work is because I think you do get two very different perspectives. You know, and so you look at the regional work in Wisconsin, well, we're basically just looking at tree species composition. And there's all sorts of other stuff that's going on in those forests in terms of, soil nutrient cycling, in terms of the small herbaceous plants that are changing. You can't get at that work using the methods that I'm using. And most of the people that have done historical ecology work are really going in and looking at the fine scale, like the Roman work I talked about in Belgium, right? They go in and they sample the local species in this plot, this 1 by 1 meter plot, and see if they can figure out what's gone on. And so for me, the question was, well, can we actually see a huge imprint at the regional level? We know that at the local level, if we go in and we have enough information, we can detect it. What does it mean at the regional level? And at the regional level, it's pretty phenomenal. I mean, we've had a fundamental shift from coniferous forest to deciduous forest, right? We're losing open oak savannas and turning that into forest. That's a huge shift in terms of land cover, which is pretty incredible, and which I think you might miss kind of the magnitude of that shift if you're only looking at local scale studies. But the local scale studies turn out to be really critical to understand kind of mechanistically what's going on and exactly, how those changes are occurring. So, and I also really enjoy doing field work, so that's the other thing. Otherwise you get stuck all the time just with historical records and you don't actually get to go out and sample to see what it is that's going on. So, and then the first question you asked about, we've got data going back to the 1960s. What's the history of the landscape before that? Well, it was an agricultural estate, is what it was. And so we knew that it was an agricultural state, that it had been cleared and put into some kind of cropland to feed the rubber boom, as it were. But we didn't actually have, when I came onto the project 5 or 6 years ago, working with Oliver Coombs, we didn't really have a really clear idea of what that looked like. So this is one of the really interesting things about the oral history. He had gone back earlier and questioned people using oral history about the fields and what the annual cultivation cycle had looked like. He hadn't mapped any of it, but he had asked people about it. And almost everybody told him that when they had cleared the forest, they cleared it from Monte Alto, big trees, which he interpreted to mean primary forest. So some of the first graphs that he put together of the village basically showed that in the 1960s it was almost all primary forest. And so then when I went and I said, okay, well, let's get some air photos and see what the air photos actually show so we can try to validate this. It was really shocking to pull that first air photo up and say, oh my God, 1965, it's actually already mostly been cleared. So that was kind of a land use legacy or a land use condition that was there that he certainly didn't expect. And frankly, from a historical ecology perspective, when you're going in and you're sampling, we've got this whole at least 50 years of land use history that we really don't know much about, which is actually making it very difficult to pull out a signal, I think in part because we've got this underlying kind of historical stuff that's going on that when we started the study we didn't know was there. You know, we went in and we started sampling and then we found the air photos and we're like, oh wow, the history is much more extensive than what we expected. You know, and so one of the things that we think is that the areas closer to the village were more impacted than other areas, and that some of the areas that were further outlying might actually have been cleared for the first time with the histories that go back, but we're not sure. So it's kind of one of the messy parts of this particular study. And if I had to go back and do it again, I would start with the air photos and pick a village to work in where we were actually pretty clear that we had a clean slate starting from where we could map out the entire land use history without kind of having this unknown history. Yeah.
There seems to be, in the background of your work, a sort of a reference state. You use terms like natural system, regional system.
Yeah.
And then at one point in your talk, you remarked that in thinking about Wisconsin, you decided the Aboriginal people hadn't had much impact. And then later on, you explained...
That's interesting. Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a really good point. Yeah.
I have a suggestion that in the Holocene epoch, there's almost no landscape that doesn't bear some sort of human imprint.
Right.
And that the notion of a reference state represents human evaluation rather than any sort of virtuous state of land.
Right.
And that leads to a question about how you get around that problem.
Yeah.
Of no reference state.
Yeah.
What's your opinion?
Yeah. Well, so it's really interesting, right? Yeah, it is really interesting. I come out of a forestry background, and so a lot of what we do with forestry stuff is we kind of try to figure out what the reference state looked like, in particular with reference to disturbance, right? So what kind of natural disturbance was going on in a system, and can we mimic that, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that there is value to understanding where we've come from in terms of history, but I was teaching a landscape ecology class last semester to a group of graduate students. And so we did a whole seminar that was on history. We read a whole bunch of papers on history, reconstructing historical ecosystem states. And we got into this fascinating discussion that basically went along the lines that you're presenting and went even further. And students were just like, you know, this is all about, you know, we've got history and things happen this way, but they don't happen this way anymore, and we wouldn't want to go back there. So really, what's the value of history? We should just throw it out completely. And it was really interesting to watch these graduate students who, to them, they just had no interest whatsoever. They're just like, well, you know, why do we even need to know about this? We just need to make decisions about what we want these ecosystems to look like in the future, and then we can go ahead and manage them. So, and I was actually quite taken aback by that. I thought, boy, does that just kind of show my age in terms of my perspective, that I actually think that history has value. And I don't think, in a lot of places we couldn't go back to historical baselines even if we wanted to. Very difficult to define what a historical baseline is, right? Is the historical baseline 1850, which happens to be when I have data? Is it further back when we had Aboriginal peoples that were actively on the landscape using these? How do we pick? I mean, is there any way that we can pick? Does any of that make any sense? But that said, I do think that there is value to understanding kind of the length of time that landscapes have been in place, how they have functioned historically. There's obviously constraints. You know, I mean, I always say that for this particular ecosystem, you're never going to get coconut trees planted outside here. They just won't grow. So having an understanding of what's historically here gives us an idea of what's possible for the future. It gives us a range of options that we can pick from. And then, of course, it comes into needing to be really transparent and clear about our values and the decisions that we're making about what we want our landscapes to provide and what that's going to look like.
On the forest plots and their species diversity,
Yeah.
richness,
Yeah.
as a function of the Tompkins clearing.
Yeah.
You'd actually expect from just sampling effects
Yeah.
that there would be a major reduction in biodiversity from the primary forest. So you know, that's not so much of a surprise, but one, from a forest ecology perspective,
Yeah.
you might have two contrasting hypotheses.
Yeah.
The species as subsamples of that
Uh-huh.
whole. And, you know, I mean, just to put it most simply,
Yeah.
you could either have a scenario in which all of the species are represented somewhat randomly
Right.
in the forest plot, or there could be a highly biased representation
Right.
of certain, say, early successional species.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering whether you've investigated that, whether you found, you know, strong effects of So this is not alpha diversity
Right.
presented, but rather you're digging into the beta diversity,
Yeah.
resulting gamma diversity,
Yeah.
of an overrepresentation of some
Yeah.
kinds of species and an
Yeah.
underrepresentation of others, and also whether there are, you know, regional effects that determine at the plot scale
Right.
the species that are represented in a given place are going to be more of those like already overrepresented species, or
Right.
whether there are certain things that a landowner can do that can bring out some of the species that are generally underrepresented in this kind of a matrix habitat.
Right. Right. So Sylvie's in the process right now. We don't have the data analysis complete, but she's looking at functional types and also at the types of the way that particular species get dispersed. So she's looking at mammal dispersed species versus bat disturbed and bird dispersed species to take a look if there's differences in terms of species composition. So, and there are, and I'm not going to remember, I think it's the mammals, so this also has to do with the function of how close things are to primary forest. So the closer you are to primary forest, I think the better represented mammal dispersed species are, because that's where the remnant mammals are on the landscape, whereas the further out you are, you've got a bigger kind of shift towards the things that are dispersed by birds and bats and things that fly. So she's been looking also at the evenness of distribution, trying to figure out, and again, I'm not going to remember, this is just like hot off the press stuff that she's just starting to come up with, so we should maybe talk later, or else, you know, talk to me in 6 months when she's actually finished this up. But the idea is to take a look not just at, obviously, species richness is one particular number, but also to take a look at the species composition as well, to try to determine, you know, to what degree do we have, you know, the same kinds of species that are coming in, and then also the relative abundance, right? So the dominance or the evenness in terms of how these species are distributed. So, and species that are closer to primary forest have much less evenness in them. So you tend to find a really long tail, I guess, going this way in terms of lots of species that are represented, one here and one there, that are just presumably seeding in from the primary forest. Whereas the further away you are from that, you tend to see a lot more dominance of a handful of individual species. So.
I just have a comment about
Yeah.
the methods courses in
Uh-huh.
the Department of Geography. I have a couple students here, but I just wanted to comment that your use of all different kinds of methods with GIS, remote sensing, air photos, historical, ethnographic research, or histories, and the way you presented them with all your graphs and stuff, I thought it was just a great way to tell the story.
Oh, thank you.
And great use of all the different methods and how we integrate them in geography to really understand the impact.
Thanks. Thanks. It's hard sometimes because you don't always know the details of everything, but yeah. And I think that's what I said too, especially with the historical stuff. I feel like a detective sometimes. It's really like you go into a system and it's really about trying to see what data are available, what creative ways can we use to put together a story, and it's fun, really, is what it is.
Final sort of observation here. One of the interesting issues which we can't get into in particular development is not an extirpated and invasive species. How that has changed everything, because
Yeah.
Gold has lots of passenger pigeons.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
You never can go back.
Yeah, that's right.
Left Gold has earthworms playing.
Yeah.
Changing the complete dynamics of
Yeah.
the system. So that's always one of these, outside issues that rules everything that you're talking about.
That's right. Right, and that goes back to the historical baseline question, doesn't it? I mean, some of the stuff we're just never going to be able to get back to because the conditions are so fundamentally different. Yeah, yeah, you're right.
We have time for a short kind of a question.
Ask.
Maybe this is a basic question, probably.
Yeah.
The underpinnings of some of your work when you talk about connectivity or proximity, does that underscore the reasons why so many land trusts or conservation organizations are trying to buy land so that they can have connectivity between different forest stands or grassland stands?
Yeah. Yeah, so it goes both ways. I mean, this is one of the big insights of conservation biology. Kai will know better than me, maybe 20 or 30 years ago. This idea that if you've got areas that are connected, it's better because it allows for organisms to flow through. And if you've got kind of a local extinction or extirpation, then you can also it would be much easier for metapopulations to reestablish. It also goes the other way, because if you've got invasive species and everything's connected, then the invasive species or pathogens or whatever else can travel also. So there's been some interesting research there as well that's kind of suggested that maybe it's not always the best thing. But one of the things that's coming out of the project that we're doing in southern Quebec is that the local municipalities are actually interested in building green corridors. And so one of the things that we've been doing is taking a look. We've got a whole series of other students that are in the field that are actually measuring ecosystem services. So this is kind of an agroforested landscape. They'll have an agricultural field, like a lot of soy and corn down there, that will come up against a forest patch. And so one of the things that they're doing is saying, well, if I go in and I measure, for example, aphids, which are an insect predator on the crops, are there a differential amount of aphids depending on whether this field is connected to a small patch of forest or a large patch of forest, or forest that's connected or a forest that's not? To try to look at some of the actual basic, the underlying kind of mechanisms, the science of how big patches of forest or small patches of forests are actually mediating ecosystem service provisioning. And we don't actually have a lot of data on kind of the connectivity or the spatial configuration of those things. But it's really interesting and important to kind of figure out, well, what is the science behind there and what does that tell us about how we should be setting up these landscapes? With the caveats, like I said, that sometimes connectivity maybe isn't the best thing. Yeah.
One final question
Yeah.
here, but so the cultural systems we see in Quebec, the way the land is divided up,
Yeah.
that has changed
Yep.
versus Wisconsin, which
Yep.
had a very different inheritance system.
Yep.
And then you really brought that up here.
Yep.
Right, because as people, pass land on to their children, does it get split up into 100 parcels, or does it stay in a single parcel?
Right.
That's the whole other
Right.
part of what's going on here.
Yep.
Is the post-cultural, or post-colonial, right?
Yep.
Effects and how that changes what's going on.
Yep. Yep. Yeah, and it's really interesting, and one of the reasons we're actually having a lot of trouble in Quebec at actually trying to piece together what that landscape looked like before the French settlers got there, because we don't have this big public land survey that was done. I mean, the public land survey was done over most of the United States except for the eastern part, and even in parts of Canada we have public land survey, but there's nothing like that in Quebec. And so some of the oldest historical topographical maps that we could find were from the period after everything had already been cleared. And so it's been really tricky to go back and try to find documents about that, although the landscape structure, like you said, is fundamentally different than it is in other places.
But there's a very good paleontological record in Quebec.
Yeah, but the problem with those records is that they tend to be really fine, right? So you get little point data here and there so that you can reconstruct what the forest composition looked like in particular areas. And that work has shown us that the forest composition was actually quite different from what it is today, but it doesn't tell us anything kind of about the extent of that forest, because we know that there was forest. We also know that there was a lot of marshland and swampland. And trying to go back to try to figure out exactly what the spatial configuration of all that was has been really difficult.
On a fine scale, yes, but on the other hand, the regional representation in Quebec is better than in most parts of North America.
Huh. Okay, so maybe we should dig in some more to those records.
Give it a shot.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jeanine.
Thanks.
For your show.